I just finished writing a book. I'm fact-checking now that's called The Case Against Sugar. It's been 6 years in the works. My wife keeps suggesting that it should be called Buzzkill, The Case Against Sugar. I try to keep my kids from eating sugar. I was listening to the conversation. It's kind of amusing. It's only a treat in our household. But I don't know how, like my wife comes back yesterday from visiting a friend in the city. We live in Oakland, and she's got a big chocolate bunny, because I guess Easter's coming up. And it seems like every other conversation with my kids, I have a 7-year-old and a 10-year-old, have been about this bunny and when they could eat it. It's amazing. And I want to say to my wife, can we just get it off the counter so they won't see it, so we don't have to discuss it? So the first chapter in my book is actually about whether sugar should be perceived as a food or a drug. The chapter is called Food or Drug, and I write about 5,000 words on the issue of its addictive properties. And when I finished it all, I have a friend who's a brilliant journalist historian named Charles Mann. He's written a couple books. One was called 1491 about the Americas before Columbus, and one was called 1493 about how foods and diseases spread around the world and plants after Columbus, what's called the Columbian Exchange. And so I finished writing my 5,000 words on addiction. I finally have something done in the book. This is the first chapter, and I'm reading my friend, his goes by Cam. I'm reading Cam's book, and he's talking a lot about sugar. And he has a parenthetical where he says, scientists debate amongst themselves whether sugar is an addictive substance or people just act like it is. And I think in about 15 words, he just encapsulated all my 5,000, and but if I throw out my 5,000, I haven't made any progress, right? So I quote him several times encapsulating this. That's my feeling on sugar as an addictive substance. It almost doesn't matter. If you have children, I don't think we need any more research, right? It's clearly something happens in their brains when they see this that makes them want to keep eating it. Just for myself, I realized a while ago, my friends tend to accuse me when I'm at dinner. They want to know why I don't want to have dessert. And I say, well, it's harder for me to have a single bite than it is not to eat it at all. And my revelation after thinking about this for about 15 years is there's no point at which anything sweet makes me full. There's no point at which I will say I've had enough. You'll stop eating it when you either feel guilty or you feel sick. But there's something about how we metabolize this and what it does to our brain where you never actually say, not for all of us. Like my wife can have 2 bites, push it aside. She's fine. If there's a dessert on the table, I'm having a mental conversation with it for the whole meal. Like, you know that where you're sitting there thinking, can I have another bite? Is it time? It's been like 3 minutes since my last bite. And not everyone thinks like that, but those of us who do, it's like it might as well be a heroin needle. Okay. Just to clarify what we're talking about, over the past 10 years, one of the things that happened is we got very confused about what we were talking about, and about 10 years ago, people decided high fructose corn syrup was the evil in the diet, and that we have to worry about that, and products like Paul Newman's lemonade says, made no high fructose corn syrup, they just replace the high fructose corn syrup with sugar. There's a whole shelf full of organic sugars at Whole Foods that are supposedly good for you because they're organic. They're not high fructose corn syrup. Pepsi now makes a deal about Pepsi that's made with real old-fashioned sugar. And the point I want to make is they're effectively the same thing. Biochemically, they're roughly 50% fructose, 50% glucose. In the high fructose corn syrup, the 2 molecules, fructose and glucose, are separate. They're not bonded together. But when we consume sugar, and even when you drink sodas, the fructose and glucose tend to break up anyway, even before they get to your gut. Biochemically, they're both the same, and the argument I make, and others like Dr. Rob Lustig at UC San Francisco, is that the question is not whether one is worse than the other, but are they both bad? And one of the arguments, this argument has been going on for about 150, well, you could probably argue 350 years, because as sugar started flowing into England in the 17th century from its new Caribbean sugar plantations, you could see sugar consumption just went up and up and up, and as it did, you started seeing diseases occurring that we didn't see before. So at the moment, those diseases, remember I talked about the crimes committed, so my talks are all, this is the grounding of them. We have an obesity epidemic, we're all aware of it, we can all think back to when, well, those of us who are of a certain age can think back to when we were in school ourselves, and there just didn't seem to be that many obese children. When I was growing up in Rochester, New York, there was one obese child in each of my years. Nowadays, obesity is skyrocketed, not just in adults, but in children. And it goes along with the diabetes epidemic. And the numbers of diabetes are even more frightening. Okay, this chart actually goes to the early 1970s. If we went back to the early 1960s, the prevalence of diabetes in the United States, according to the Centers for Disease Control, has increased 900%. And one of the arguments we make, I've co-founded a not-for-profit called the Nutrition Science Initiative, which is trying to fund and facilitate research to resolve some of these dietary controversies. And one of the arguments we make is that if this was any other disease, like imagine if HIV mortality had increased by 900% since the 1980s. So in the mid-1980s, scientists conclude that the AIDS virus is caused by HIV, and we create drugs, antiretroviral drugs, and we promote self-sex, and lo and behold, 30 years later, you've got a 900% increase in prevalence and mortality. You would have task force all around the country, all in the world, trying to figure out what it is about this disease we don't understand. Obviously, we missed something. Maybe it's not HIV. Maybe there's something else involved, but if we had that 900% increase or a 200% increase, we would have task force. In obesity and diabetes, there's nothing. And the reason there's nothing is because we think we understand what causes these diseases. So the idea, let me put that on hold for a second. There's one other thing to keep in mind when we discuss these diseases. Okay, one thing that scares us so much about them is that obesity and diabetes are associated with a whole host of other chronic diseases. So what that means is if you're obese or you're diabetic, you're at higher risk of getting all the diseases on this chart, including stroke, including fatty liver disease, including cancer, including Alzheimer's. So the heavier you are, the more diabetic you are, the greater your risk. So what we want to know more than anything, what we should want to know is what is it that causes obesity and diabetes. Because if we understand that, we can lower the risk, we can act on it, we can lower the risk of all these diseases. So why do we get fat? That's the question that's driven my research. My second book on this was called Why We Get Fat. And when it comes to sugar, there's sort of two theories at play. One is this idea that sugar is empty calories. It's an idea that dates back about 100 years when all people studied were the calorie contents of foods and their vitamin and mineral contents. And they sat there and they said, look, sugar has no vitamins, and it doesn't come with any minerals, it doesn't come with any micronutrients, not that they knew what that was 100 years ago, it doesn't come with any protein attached, there's no fiber attached. It's empty of all of these. And so if you eat it, you're either eating it on top of the calories you need that do come with vitamins and minerals you need, in which case it's excess calories, or you're replacing these foods, in which case you're not getting enough. So that is where this concept of empty calories comes from. And it's a 100-year-old concept, and it's a 100-year-old science, and it was locked in. One of the points I make in my book is that nutrition and obesity researchers, for reasons that I'm not going to go into long conversation, they just locked in on a 100-year-old idea, and we couldn't dislodge them. And one of the things my Nutrition Science Initiative is trying to do is dislodge them with better research. So the whole science of endocrinology grows up in the 1960s. Endocrinology is a study of hormones and hormone-related diseases. It actually begins around the 1920s with the discovery of the hormone insulin and growth hormone, and it explodes in the 1960s with the discovery of a technique that allows people to actually measure accurately hormone levels in the blood. And out of that, you get this other hypothesis, which is that foods have specific hormonal metabolic effects. Every food you consume is treated by your body differently. So protein is treated differently than fat, which is treated differently than carbohydrates. Different types of carbohydrates are treated differently. So fructose, which is half of a sugar molecule, is metabolized in your liver. And glucose, which is the other half of the sugar molecule, and which is what you get when you eat starch, is metabolized in every cell of your body. So this alternative hypothesis says that foods have different hormonal metabolic effects. If you actually secrete different hormones at different amounts in response to different foods, it's going to have a different effect, not just on how your body processes that food, but how your bodies do things like accumulate fat. Okay? Like I said, the problem is the nutrition obesity community, they like their calories idea. We haven't been able to get them off it yet, although we're getting there. So from this calorie idea, we have, this is what we believe are the theory, this is why people get fat. You've all heard this, you eat too much. Take in more calories than you expend, you get fat. It's a conventional wisdom. It seems so obvious that to argue otherwise has people accusing you of being a quack. When my second book came out, I was on the Larry King show, and Jillian Michaels, a trainer from The Biggest Loser, came on from Los Angeles and gave me a lecture on national television about the laws of thermodynamics, implying that if I said that obesity was caused by anything other than calories in over calories out, I was a quack. And when they cut to an advertisement, I was sitting next to Mehmet Oz, and I turned to Mehmet and I said, I got a physics degree from Harvard, and I just got lectured on national television by a trainer from The Biggest Loser. What's wrong with my life? Anyway, the sugar industry loved this calories idea. Okay? In my book, I refer to it as the gift that keeps on giving. From the 1930s onward, the sugar industry said, look, there's nothing special about sugar. We don't care. That if people get fat, it's because they eat too much. If you eat too much broccoli, you get fat, and you could always exercise more. So the sugar industry up there at the top, it's like, I'm having trouble. 3 teaspoons of sugar is, I can't read it. Fewer calories in your egg. Okay? So you could always put sugar in your coffee, you don't have an egg, you're fine. Or you could put sugar in your coffee, have the egg, and go for a long walk and burn it off, so you increase your expenditure. And this was a wonderful idea, and it's allowed, we've kept it going ever since, and the sugar industry still uses it on their websites. And this is the argument that you find in scientific journals. It's all about calories. There's nothing uniquely toxic about this substance, it's just that we like it. We eat too much of it, so eat a little less, exercise more. Okay, so here's the logic, again, from the Sugar Organization. Sugar's not the cause of obesity. Consuming more food than you need is the cause. If you eat more calories of anything, you'll gain weight. It's not sugar, okay? And it's all about personal responsibility. If you want to lose weight, you'll need to eat fewer calories or increase your activity level. So this is basically the conventional thinking, and all our efforts to prevent obesity and diabetes are aimed at basically getting people to eat less or getting them to exercise more. We now tell people, finally we say consume less sugary beverages, but we do so because of this empty calorie ideas. Clearly we drink a lot of sugary beverages, clearly we don't need them, so drink less of it. In other words, there are no bad foods, only bad behaviors. And another way to think about this, here's the other hypothesis, what if sugar is toxic? Okay, this is the metabolic hormonal effect hypothesis. This is the buzzkill hypothesis, my wife would put it. Okay, so in this hypothesis, 100 calories of sugar has an entirely different effect than 100 calories of, pick it, glucose, fat, protein, the lactose, you know, saturated fat, unsaturated, they have different effects. Why do we think sugar has a bad effect when these other foods do? So it's not about the calories, it's about what these foods do to you when you consume them, okay? The problem is, so in the 1970s, this hypothesis got a lot of play. There was a British scientist I'll talk about briefly named John Yudkin who became convinced that sugar was the problem. It caused a condition called insulin resistance. And once you're insulin resistant, you now have a whole host of diseases. The sugar industry actually put together a public relations campaign, and they hired scientists who believed that dietary fat was the problem, including most prominently the head of the nutrition department at Harvard, who was almost unbelievable in his willingness to take money from industry and say anything. And they put together a document called Sugar in the Diet of Man, and then there were several government assessments of whether sugar should be what's called generally recognized as safe by the FDA. And the FDA used this sugar industry document, and in 1986, they came down with their final word on this subject, and this remains the final word to this day. No conclusive evidence on sugars demonstrates a hazard to the general public when sugars are consumed at the levels that are now current. That was a 1986 conclusion. And the sugar industry version of this is fascinating. So basically what the FDA said is we don't have conclusive evidence. It's like we've had a court case. The evidence has been presented on both sides. It's ambiguous, so we are going to have to acquit sugar. The way I describe it, it's like I'm willing to believe that when O.J. Simpson was acquitted, the evidence was ambiguous, but if I'm going to date one of his old girlfriends, I don't want him living around the corner from me. Okay? You know, there's a difference between the evidence being ambiguous and somebody being innocent. And what the sugar industry did is they took this FDA report that said the evidence are ambiguous, therefore we're going to say there's no evidence of hazard, and they said that it clears sugars of causing all these diseases, which is not what it did. Now here's the FDA assessment. This was what fascinated me when I was doing my historical research. So they say when sugars are consumed at the levels that are now current. So this FDA report, which went on, it was 3 FDA bureaucrats who worked on this for a couple years. They actually calculated what they thought sugar consumption was in the United States, and they estimated sugar consumption at 40 pounds per person per year, and they said that's what we consider safe. And the same year they said that, the USDA estimates were 75 pounds per person per year. And the USDA estimates for 2011, actually we went up to 150 pounds, and now we're back again. There's a lot of, they estimate loss and et cetera, so now they're saying 90 pounds per year. So our official government statement from the FDA was it's safe if you only eat 40 pounds per year. That's about 40 grams a day. It's about a Coke and a half. We eat at least 2.5 times, and that's per capita. Okay, there's 10 to 20% of the population eats twice that. Actually, one of the debates they had in the 1970s, the National Academy of Sciences had a discussion on this, and one of the expert speakers said, you know, it's kind of like the statement where somebody said that this person drowned in a lake that had an average depth of 3 feet. And it might have had an average depth of 3 foot, but the person happened to be in 20 feet of water when he drowned. So the average consumption might be 90 pounds per year, but there's a lot of us who eat none of it, and a lot of us, particularly teenagers, who eat at least twice that. So here's a little more history. And I'm going to tell you a story. This is a story that I start my book with. Elliot Joslin. In Harvard and Boston now, there's the Joslin Diabetes Research Center. It's the most prestigious research center in the country. Elliot Joslin in the 1890s was a young medical student at Harvard. He had graduated from Yale. He went to Harvard. He saw his first diabetic patient when he was a medical student in 1893. It was a woman named Mary Higgins. She was an Irish, she had emigrated from Ireland about 5 years earlier. She found herself exhausted all the time, peeing all the time, thirsty all the time. She went to Harvard Medical School, to Massachusetts General Hospital. Joslin diagnosed, Joslin and these other doctors diagnosed her with diabetes, and Joslin becomes obsessed with this. And over the next 5 years, he and a famous Harvard pathologist named Reginald Fitz combed through all the handwritten records of Massachusetts General Hospital, which had been founded in 1821. So they have records from 1824 to 1898. It's almost 3/4 of a century. They combed through 48,000 records, patient records, looking for every case of diabetes they could find. And in 3/4 of a century, they find 172 cases of diabetes, okay, from the major hospital in the city of Boston. And in the first 45 years, 25 of the first 45 years, there are 0 cases of diabetes. Now, this chart I'm showing you here is from Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia, which is the oldest hospital in America. And you could see, let's see if this is you could see up until about 1910, there is no year with more than 10 cases of diabetes. Now today, 1 in 11 Americans are supposed to have diabetes. There's just a study that came out this week that 50% of California adults are pre-diabetic. And yet in the 19th century, major urban hospitals saw virtually no cases. Now, this is a graph from 80 years later, 50 years later. This is a chart that shows diabetes inpatients at the major hospital that serves the Navajo Reservation in northwest New Mexico and into Nevada. And you could see it's almost identical in the sense that in this case, until the 1960s, there's virtually no diabetes. And then it explodes. In the Pima Indians, which are in a tribe in New Mexico south of Santa Fe, you see the exact same numbers. There's actually various physicians who talked about diabetes cases. They just didn't see diabetes in the Pima. They were beginning to see obesity post-war, but no diabetes. And then in 1965, NIH, a team of 3 NIH researchers go out to Phoenix to actually study rheumatoid arthritis. They wanted to study it in dry atmospheres, high altitudes, and they do blood tests from 1,000 Pimas in 1965, and 50% of the adults have diabetic levels of blood sugar. But they're not in the hospitals. And they want to know, how can they have diabetes? Is a horrible disease. I mean, you go blind, you have amputations, you get gangrene, you get kidney damage, and yet the hospitals don't see these patients. And within another 10 years, the hospitals were full of diabetic Pimas. And the question is, what happened? Oh, thank you. I thought you were going to.
Tell you you're done. No.
Yeah, we're done. You're done. What causes this kind of curve? Here's a study that was done in 1924 by the leading, the head of the public health department in New York City, just comparing diabetes mortality rates between, 1900 and 1920 in major American cities, and diabetes was skyrocketing. In fact, by 1921, Jocelyn, in an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association, is writing about diabetes as an epidemic. By the 1930s, it's clearly an epidemic. It seems to be an epidemic worldwide, and this Haven Emerson, who was the head of public health in New York, said, hey, diabetes has been skyrocketing, sugar consumption has been skyrocketing. And when sugar goes down and diabetes goes down, maybe there's a cause and effect here. And what's fascinating, if you think back to that Pennsylvania hospital chart, this one, we don't really think about this much, but when you think about all the ways you can get sugar today, leaving out all the extra foods, everything, the 80% of the products in the market, when you think about candies, ice cream, sodas, chocolate, all of those industries, so the candy industry, the ice cream industry, the chocolate industry, were all created in about right about 1850, pretty much with the Industrial Revolution. The soda industry is created around 1885, Coca-Cola, Pepsi comes a decade later, and by the early 1900s, I mean, throughout this period, sugar consumption is skyrocketing. And the way we're getting sugar is changing. And the mechanisms for delivering it, the trains to take these products coast to coast, the boxes to package them, the advertising genius to sell them, are all exploding right in this period down here. And then by the 20th century, you start seeing this explosion of diabetes. And again, these numbers are actually trivial compared to, remember I said there was a 900% increase from the 1960s onward. If you go back down to these numbers, you're talking about a 9,000% increase. So a disease that really didn't seem to exist in the 19th century exploded in the 20th century. It exploded coincident with this increase in sugar consumption. And when we created all these foods, so sugar in the 18th century is still expensive. In the 19th century, it starts to become inexpensive. And it becomes a food for children. All these industries start catering to kids. Used to be sugar was too expensive for children, and only rich people had it. And then the second half of the 19th century, these industries are targeting children and actually women too. The men are getting alcohol, the women are getting sugar. So this theory that sugar was the cause of it was very popular in the 1920s. Elliot Jocelyn didn't believe it. The reason Jocelyn didn't believe it, Jocelyn didn't understand that glucose and fructose were different. He thought they were all the same. It's all starch. And he pointed out that in Japan, they ate a lot of starch, and yet in the 1940s, they had virtually no diabetes. You could actually go all the way back. What's interesting, what Jocelyn didn't know, because he didn't realize that sugar was different than starches, is that sugar consumption was actually small. This 15 pounds per year, this is about 15 kilograms per year, so this is about 30 pounds per year. It's about 1/3 what Americans were consuming at the time. So what you see in the 1930s and 1940s, Elliot Jocelyn, in medicine, one influential figure can dominate thinking in the field. Elliot Jocelyn didn't believe sugar caused diabetes, so the medical establishment didn't believe sugar caused diabetes. It was that simple. Here's a little more history. Beginning in the 1960s, I told you John Yudkin starts demonizing sugar. Now we can measure insulin in the bloodstream, this hormone, and suddenly there's this whole cluster of disease of disorders that we're going to talk about briefly that sugar can cause. You just feed animals sugar, you feed humans sugar, and things start happening to them that don't happen when you feed them starch or other foods. Unfortunately, this fellow, Ansel Keys, didn't like this theory. He was the guy who was telling us that dietary fat was bad for us. So Keys went about ridiculing Yudkin. The two of them fought. The sugar industry got behind Keys because he was blaming fat. And Keys had been funded by the sugar industry since the early 1940s. So this whole idea that sugar causes disease vanishes. And then what happens, it's fascinating. So by the 1970s, we're blaming dietary fat for everything, saturated fat for everything. How many of you eat low-fat diets? Do you try to avoid fat? We have just one person in the room tries to avoid fat? Come on. Well, I have been making progress. So the reason the idea that dietary fat's bad is it raises cholesterol. Cholesterol gives us heart disease. That was the science of the 1960s. While that science was being sort of baked into our public health guidelines, this other idea comes up, that the reason you get heart disease isn't saturated fat and cholesterol, it's this thing called metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome is a disease of insulin resistance. So it's a combination of medical disorders that increase the risk of developing heart disease and diabetes. It affects 1 in 5 people. Actually, the estimate today is 75 to 100 million adults in the United States, maybe 40 million children. A lot. Let me just say a lot. I hate to quote these numbers because I'll invariably get them wrong. Some studies estimate the prevalence in the US to be up to 25% of the population. The older you get, the more likely it is you'll have metabolic syndrome. So if you don't have it when you're young, by the time you're in your 50s and 60s and 70s, there's a 40%, 45% chance that you're going to have metabolic syndrome and be at high risk of heart disease and diabetes. If you get these diseases, if you have a heart attack, the chances are very good. It's not because you have high LDL cholesterol and have been eating too much saturated fat. It's because you have metabolic syndrome. And the question is, what causes metabolic syndrome? So this disorder started to emerge in the literature. People started studying in the 1950s. In the 1960s, they were putting it together. There's a group at Stanford led by an endocrinologist named Gerald Reaven. John Yudkin was looking at this when he was implicating sugar. 1988, it finally seeps into the diabetes community when Reaven at Stanford gives his what's called the Banting Lecture at the annual conference of the American Diabetes Association. The heart disease people don't care about this because they're concerned with fat and heart disease. The question is, what causes metabolic syndrome? So among these disorders of metabolic syndrome, one is your waist size is getting bigger. Okay, when you go to the doctor, if your doctor is going to diagnose metabolic syndrome, the first thing he's going to look at is your waist getting bigger. So if your waist is getting bigger, you probably have metabolic syndrome. More so for men than women, by the way. So women tend to be a little protected against this. If your HDL, the good cholesterol, if that's low, that's a sign of metabolic syndrome. If your blood pressure is high, that's a sign of metabolic syndrome. It's a cluster of disorders that tend to go together. If you've ever heard the phrase glucose intolerant, if your doctor says to you, you look a little glucose intolerant, that's a sign of metabolic syndrome. It's kind of a preliminary step before diabetes and before heart disease. And you ask the question, what causes this? And the conventional wisdom, because it's linked to obesity and getting fatter, is that it's because you ate too many calories, right? You don't exercise enough. People think exercise is a good way to prevent metabolic syndrome. But here's the less technical lingo. Metabolic effects of fructose. In high fructose intake, fructose is, remember, that's half of a sugar molecule, half of high fructose corn syrup. has indeed been shown, this is a technical language, it's been shown to cause dyslipidemia. That means your HDL is low, your high triglycerides, although there's compelling evidence that very high fructose intake can have deleterious metabolic effects in rodents. So the gist of it is, sugar appears to be able to cause metabolic syndrome. In fact, the researchers started studying this in the 1980s because the easiest way to cause this thing called metabolic syndrome in lab rats was to feed them a lot of sugar. Here's how at the end, basically, you end up with fructose. So metabolic syndrome is a state of being resistant to insulin. And here's all the different ways, I won't get into the technical ways, in which fructose, which means sugar, would end up causing metabolic syndrome. Here's another chart basically showing the same thing. Insulin resistance is the state of metabolic syndrome. So you have a whole field of science that's grown up since the 1980s that basically implicates sugar and metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome is this condition of being resistant to the hormone insulin. And it's the step on the way to obesity and diabetes. So when we say, people like me, that sugar is probably toxic, what we mean is sugar probably causes metabolic syndrome, which means it probably causes obesity, diabetes, and heart disease, which means it probably causes all the diseases that associate. Remember, I started this talking about all the diseases you're at increased risk of when you have obesity and diabetes, which includes cancer and Alzheimer's. So we're going to talk about this. The problem right now is meaningful studies. The research community doesn't do meaningful studies on this. That's a longer story. There's one exception to this. Actually, there's a group at UC Davis that's been studying metabolic syndrome and the effects on sugar. And as they did a study on 30 rats, 30 monkeys a couple years ago. They published it. They fed them a high sugar diet. They basically just let them drink sugary beverages whenever they wanted to. And something like 28 of the 30 ended up with metabolic syndrome, and subset, I think it was 4 of them, developed diabetes in a year, just by letting them drink sugary beverages over the course of a year. Conclusion for the moment. Okay, this is how the Institute of Medicine phrased it. The Institute of Medicine did a study in which they looked at sugar consumption and the effect on obesity, diabetes, and heart disease, and insulin resistance, and they said that there's a lack of scientific agreement, and it's controversial, which it is. Okay? And the studies, like I said, are ambiguous. But if you believe them, if you're worried about it, I'm going to get to this in a second. We have a substance out there that your children are consuming, that we're consuming because we think we can balance it. We could have a Coke, or we could have a soft drink, or we could have fruit juice and work out, and it's going to be fine. And it may or may not cause insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, and the diseases that associate with it. There's a scientific controversy. Like I said, the circumstantial evidence is very compelling. You add sugar to any diet. Those charts I showed you about the Navajo and Philadelphia hospital, I could show you a chart like that for virtually every nation and every population in the world. From the Inuit in the Arctic Circle, to the Maasai on the hills of Kenya, to South Pacific Islanders, to the Middle East, anywhere you add sugar to their diets, you see this explosion of diabetes and obesity. Okay? It appears, although it's controversial, that sugar is the cause of diabetes. That if we didn't have sugar in our diets, diabetes would be as rare as lung cancer would be if we didn't smoke cigarettes. So here's the Grinch trying to steal Christmas. My wife is a humorist. So one of the other titles that we were thinking of for my book was going to be Stealing Christmas, the case against sugar. This is the Grinch problem. Okay, everything else with sugar is fine, right? Because hey, if you're getting fat or your doctor says you're getting insulin resistant, you could just cut back. Now's the time. So you eat it, you let your kids eat it, and then you cut back when it starts to get bad. But what if you don't see the bad stuff until it's too late? Does sugar cause cancer? Okay? This, by the way, now I'm in quackery land, so I have to warn you. I mean quackery land the way the other people perceive it. This is a chart I told you about. So obesity increases your risk of all these diseases, and one of those diseases is cancer. This is a well-accepted phenomenon. Now, what's fascinating, when you look in the history, cancer appeared to be a very rare disease in the 19th century as well. In fact, there were populations in which you couldn't find cancer. So Albert Schweitzer, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1953, if I remember correctly, for his missionary work in Equatorial Africa. He opened a missionary hospital in the Gabon in Africa in 1913. He didn't see his first cases of cancer in a black African until the 1930s, and he treated about 90 patients a day. Okay? And he did not take days off. There can be little doubt, but that cancer is a disease affecting natives of British Central Africa is of the most rarity. This was a common statement in the missionary literature. This was a British research that lasted through the Second World War, when basically we got distracted by other things. The British had missionary and colonial physicians all around the world. And they actually, beginning in 1904, they founded the British Cancer Research Fund, and the purpose of it was to find out how common cancer was. And they sent messages to all the missionaries all around the world saying, report on your cancer, your numbers of cancer. They actually send samples back. And if you take a cancer out of a patient or something you think is a cancer, package it in formaldehyde, put it in the bottle, ship it back. It'll take 3 months to get to London. We'll see if it's really a malignancy. And time again, this is what they got back, statements like this. Alex Fredlicka was the actually head of physical anthropology for the Smithsonian Institute. He was a physician who became an anthropologist. He traveled around the southwest United States, took several expeditions over the course of 8 years at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Didn't see cancer in Native Americans in that time period. Frederick Hoffman was one of the founders of the American Cancer Society. He was a biostatistician for, if I remember correctly, Metropolitan Life. He put together an 800-page report. There was a report for the American Cancer Society, basically looking at all this information of cancer around the world, and the conclusion was they couldn't find it. It was demonstrably absent. These terrific physicians trained in Europe, trained in the United Kingdom, trained in America, went out around the world to treat patients who were living indigenous lifestyles, eating their native diets. They didn't see anything like the cancer they saw back with the West. Hoffman himself did a study of the Native Americans, as he said, in 1914, 2 deaths out of 63,000 Indians. Charts were drawn of cancer rates going up with time, cancer mortality. Some of this was clearly a diagnostic effect. People were looking harder for the disease. They were more likely to put the disease on a death certificate if somebody died from it. But they couldn't explain the size of the increase. Here's Hoffman and the mortality from cancer throughout the world. In contrast to a marked decline in the general death rate, cancer remains one of the few diseases actively and persistently on the increase in practically all of the countries and large cities for which trustworthy data are obtainable. Today, 1 in 8 Americans will get cancer. Again, you just ask this question, where was it? Okay? There are a lot of explanations for why you might not see it, but why weren't people in the hospitals dying of cancer? Number of cases of breast cancer in Inuit women in the Western and Central Arctic diagnosed before 1962, and the answer is 0. Okay? So the same observation that you could see in the literature that was discussed and studied from about the 1870s to the 1940s continues post-war in some populations, well-studied populations. The same researchers, the same physicians who studied the Navajo described breast cancer emerging about 10 years after diabetes did. 1960s, none of it. 1970s, women start getting breast cancer in these populations. Studies, relatively recent epidemiologic studies of comparing cancer in different populations and cancer rates in populations that migrate from one area of the world to another. Classic example are Japanese. In Japan, Japanese women don't seem to get breast cancer. They come to the US by the 2nd generation. Japanese Americans have the same breast cancer rates of every other population. The question is, what causes it? one of these seminal studies back in 1981, Richard Dahl, one of the authors, was knighted for his work linking cigarettes to lung cancer. They concluded that 10 to 70% of the cancers that we get are caused by diet. Don't know what that number is, but it's at least as large, possibly larger than cigarettes. Okay, here's the technical lingo. Basically what I'm going to get to is the argument that insulin resistance basically increases insulin levels in your body. So if you're metabolic syndrome, if you're getting fatter, you have high levels of insulin. If you have high levels of insulin, you also probably have high levels of blood sugar. Both of them fuel cancer growth. Here's how it looks in the technical diagram. So you've got insulin resistance, and it goes boom, 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 and you end up somewhere down here with, I'm assuming that's a tumor cell. I have trouble seeing this slide. And the question is, what causes the insulin resistance? Metformin is a wonderful drug. Metformin is a drug for diabetics. It lowers insulin levels, and it turns out that diabetics who take metformin have lower cancer rates than diabetics who get insulin. Luke Hanley, actually he's now at Cornell Medical School, he's no longer at Harvard, one of the leading cancer researchers in the country, says metformin may have already saved more people from cancer deaths than any drug in history. The way it works is by lowering your insulin levels. So you're back to this question, what is it that raises insulin levels? And the answer to these researchers who study this connection is sugar. Okay, Craig Thompson is the president of Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York. This is probably the most prestigious cancer research hospital in the world. Thompson doesn't eat sugar because he thinks sugar causes cancer. And Luke Hanley, who's now director of the cancer center at, I thought I changed the slide, cancer center at Weill Cornell Medical School. He moved to New York a few years ago. Lou also says the same thing. These people don't eat sugar, not because they're worried about their weight, but because they think if they avoid sugar, they will lower their risk of getting cancer. That's my last slide. Sugar scares me. I mean, there are a lot of diseases that are linked to obesity and diabetes and metabolic syndrome. When you look at what happened to populations like the Pima, remember I told you this population, in the 1950s you're seeing obesity in the children. Certainly, the kids were all fat by the 1950s, but no apparent diabetes. And then these NIH researchers come in 1965, and they do all these blood tests, and they realize that half the Pima adults have diabetic levels of blood sugar. And by the 1970s, the hospitals are full of them. And they're getting amputated, and they're going blind, and they're having kidney failure. And the NIH starts a study, excuse me. The NIH starts a study where they follow the Pima, the adults who have cancer, who have diabetes, and then they follow them as they have children, and then they follow the children. And by the 1980s, it's clear that if a child is born to a diabetic mother, his or her risk of getting diabetes by the time he or she is 25 is 45 times greater than a child who's born to a mother who's not diabetic. So it becomes fairly clear in this population that diabetic mothers give birth to children who are much higher risk of getting diabetes. And even non-diabetic, mothers with metabolic syndrome, mothers with high blood sugar, this is why you have these gestational diabetes tests when you're pregnant. Their risk is about 20-fold higher than a healthy woman. So there's a really strong possibility that this disorder is actually passed on from mother to child in the womb, what's called the intrauterine environment. And if so, we're giving birth to kids who are at much higher risk of all these diseases. The reason those of us who get fat by the time we're teenagers, by the time we're in our 20s or 30s or 40s, it's not because we're eating too much or eating more than our siblings or our friends. It's because we're programmed from birth to get fat. And if I'm right, and again, I can't prove it, if I'm right, sugar is the primary suspect in all of this. That's it. That's my buzzkill lecture.
Well, let's give Gary a big hand.